Blood dripped steadily onto shattered glass. Pinned beneath a crushed steering wheel, Chloe heard the unmistakable, bone-rattling roar of Harley-Davidson engines cutting through the dead of night, when a massive figure wearing a Hell's Angels death head patch loomed over her. She was certain her life was entirely over. Headlights sliced through the torrential downpour of Highway 395, illuminating nothing but the relentless sheets of rain and the desolate stretch of asphalt ahead. Chloe gripped the steering wheel of her battered Honda Civic, her knuckles white with tension. She was 28, utterly exhausted, and pushing through the final treacherous leg of a drive from Reno back home to Los Angeles. It was past 2 in the morning, but Twelm, the radio had long since dissolved into static, leaving only the hypnotic, rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers to keep her company. Fatigue pulled heavily at her eyelids, but she couldn't afford to stop. Her father had been admitted to the ICU earlier that evening, and every passing minute felt like a ticking clock echoing in her chest. She needed to be there. She pressed her foot down on the accelerator, desperate to navigate the winding mountainous roads of the eastern Sierra before the storm worsened. But the mountains have a way of punishing the desperate. Without warning, a massive shape erupted from the darkness of the tree line. A large buck, panicked by the storm, leaped directly into the center of her lane. Chloe didn't have time to scream. Pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct took over. She jerked the steering wheel violently to the right, slamming her foot onto the brake pedal. It was a fatal mistake on slick pavement. The tires lost all traction, hydroplaning across the wet asphalt. The world outside her windows blurred into a chaotic vortex of darkness and blinding rain. The car slammed through the flimsy steel guardrail with a deafening screech of tearing metal. Weightlessness took over for a terrifying, agonizing second as the vehicle launched into the black abyss of the steep ravine. Then came the impacts. The car rolled end over end, violently smashing against ancient pines and jagged boulders. Glass exploded inward like shrapnel. The roof buckled, groaning under the immense pressure of the earth, until the vehicle finally came to a sudden, bone-shattering halt at the bottom of the embankment, completely overturned. Silence rushed in, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hiss of steam escaping the crushed radiator. Inside the mangled wreckage, Chloe hung upside down, restrained by a seatbelt that dug into her collarbone like a garrote. Blood trickled down her forehead, blinding her left eye. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, trying to process the catastrophic reality of her situation. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at her throat. She needed to get out. The heavy metallic stench of gasoline was beginning to fill the cramped cabin, a terrifying indicator of impending fire. She pushed her hands against the collapsed roof, trying to leverage herself upward. "Move," she commanded her body. "Just move." Nothing happened. A cold wave of absolute horror washed over her. From her waist down, there was nothing but a terrifying, empty numbness. She couldn't feel her legs. She couldn't wiggle her toes. The crushing weight of the engine block had folded the dashboard inward, pinning her lower half beneath a vice grip of twisted steel and shattered plastic. "Help!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her raw throat, but it was instantly swallowed by the roar of the storm outside. "Somebody, please!" She frantically patted the roof around her, her fingers searching for her phone in the dark. Her hand brushed against a piece of jagged glass, slicing her palm, before finally resting on the familiar rectangular shape of her phone. Hope surged until her thumb traced the shattered screen. It was completely dead, destroyed in the tumbling descent. She was 70 feet down a steep, heavily wooded ravine, completely invisible from the desolate highway above. It was 3 in the morning, freezing, and she was entirely paralyzed from the waist down. The agonizing realization settled into her bones. No one knew she was down here. No one was coming. As the adrenaline began to fade, the true extent of her injuries made themselves known. A searing, white-hot pain radiated from her spine, making every shallow breath a desperate battle. Hypothermia began to creep in as the freezing rain poured through the shattered windows, soaking her thin cotton shirt. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. The darkness around her seemed to tighten, pressing against the crushed windows, waiting to consume her entirely. She closed her eyes, tears mixing with the blood and rain on her face, and prayed for a miracle she knew was impossible. Hours crawled by like agonizing lifetimes. The cold had numbed her upper body, replacing the sharp pains with a dangerous, lethargic heaviness. Chloe was drifting in and out of consciousness, her mind playing cruel tricks on her, conjuring the sounds of her father's voice or the phantom warmth of a fire. She knew, with a quiet, terrifying certainty, that she was dying. The gasoline smell was still there, but the immediate threat of a spark had passed. Now, the real enemy was the cold in her broken body. Then she felt it. It didn't start as a sound, but as a vibration in the earth. A low, rhythmic tremor that traveled through the muddy ground and into the crushed steel of her car. Slowly, the vibration morphed into a deep, guttural roar. Engines. Chloe forced her heavy eyes open. Above her, at the top of the ravine, beams of blinding yellow light swept across the wet canopy of the trees. It wasn't the steady hum of an 18-wheeler or the whine of a passing sedan. It was the synchronized, thunderous idle of a pack of heavy motorcycles. Bikers, the engines cut off one by one, plunging the highway back into relative silence, save for the patter of the dying rain. Then came the crunch of heavy boots on gravel, the low murmur of gruff voices, and the sweeping arcs of high-powered flashlights cutting through the dark. "Tire tracks right here," a deep voice echoed from above. "Guardrails too to hell." Something went over. "Shine it down there, Wyatt. All the way to the bottom." A beam of light pierced the darkness, sweeping over the boulders and trees before finally hitting the reflective taillight of Chloe's upside-down Civic. "Got a vehicle," another voice yelled. "Looks bad, man. Looks real bad." Chloe tried to scream, to let them know she was alive, but her voice was nothing more than a pathetic, wet rasp. "I'm here." Footsteps began to slide and crash down the muddy embankment. Brush snapped and rocks tumbled as heavy bodies navigated the steep, dangerous trough. The flashlight beams bounced wildly, illuminating the approaching figures. As the first man stepped into the ambient light near the wreckage, Chloe's fragile hope instantly mutated into absolute terror. He was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet, clad in heavy, rain-soaked leather. Even in the dim light, she could see the unmistakable patches on his cut, the curved top rocker, the one, Verdennant, and the terrifying winged death head logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. His face was obscured by a thick, wet beard, and his arms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, were covered in dark, menacing tattoos. Another biker stepped up beside him, equally imposing, wearing a grim scowl beneath a leather flat cap. Chloe's mind flooded with every horrifying stereotype and sensationalized news story she had ever heard. To her panicked, exhausted brain, she hadn't been found by saviors. She'd been found by monsters on a desolate road where no one could hear her scream. The giant biker approached the shattered driver's side window, shining his heavy maglite into the cab. The beam hit Chloe's bloody, terrified face. "Jesus," the man breathed, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He immediately dropped to his knees in the mud, wedging his massive shoulders into the crushed opening of the window. His sheer size seemed to block out whatever little air was left in the car. Chloe's chest heaved. The terrifying lore of the Hells Angels, the violence, the outlaws, the ruthless reputation built by men like Sonny Barger paralyzed her just as much as the twisted steel. As the massive biker reached a thick, leather-gloved hand toward her face, she squeezed her eyes shut, a sob tearing from her throat. "Please," she whimpered, her voice trembling with absolute despair. "Please don't hurt me. I can't move." The giant man froze. For a fraction of a second, the only sound was the hiss of the engine and the dripping rain. Then, something extraordinary happened. The menacing Hells Angel slowly pulled his hand back. He reached up, grasped the thick leather of his riding gloves, and pulled them off, tossing them into the mud. When he reached for her again, it wasn't to grab her. His bare hands were callous but incredibly warm, and they cupped her freezing, blood-stained cheeks with a gentleness that completely shattered her reality. "I'm not here to hurt you, sweetheart," he said. The gruffness in his voice was gone, replaced by a soothing, remarkably calm authority. My name is Arthur, but my brothers call me Bear. You're safe now. Do you hear me? You are completely safe. Chloe opened her eyes, staring into the face of the man she thought was her grim reaper. Underneath the rugged exterior and the outlaw patches, his dark eyes were full of profound empathy and intense focus. I can't feel my legs, she sobbed, the dam finally breaking. There, I can't feel them. I'm stuck. Bear's expression didn't falter. He leaned further into the wreckage, his massive frame shielding her from the biting wind. He expertly slid 2 fingers against her neck to check her pulse, then gently ran his hands along the rigid line of her cervical spine. Okay, listen to me very carefully, Bear commanded, his tone shifting into something that sounded remarkably like a battlefield commander. I need you to keep your head perfectly still. Don't try to look around. I'm going to hold your neck, he yelled over his shoulder without taking his eyes off her. Wyatt, get the emergency med bag off the back of my chopper. Tommy, we have 0 cell service down here. Right back up to that mile marker we passed. Hit the emergency call box and get life flight down here immediately. Tell them we have a severe trauma, possible spinal cord compression, and severe entrapment. Move. Chloe stared at the giant outlaw biker in sheer disbelief. How do you know what to do? She whispered. Bear offered her a small, reassuring smile that crinkled the edges of his weathered eyes. Before I wore this patch, darling, I wore a different uniform. Spent 8 years as an Army combat medic in the Korengal Valley. Trust me, I pull people out of a hell of a lot worse than a broken-down Honda. He positioned his large hands firmly but delicately on either side of her head, completely stabilizing her neck. The terrifying biker from her nightmares was suddenly the most comforting presence she had ever known. We're going to get you out of here, Bear promised, the rain dripping from his beard onto the crushed dashboard. The Hells Angels are with you now. You aren't dying tonight. Rain continued to batter the twisted metal of the Honda Civic, but the freezing terror that had gripped Chloe's heart was slowly being replaced by a surreal, fragile sense of security. Bear remained wedged inside the crushed window frame, his massive, tattooed arms acting as unyielding pillars on either side of her head. He didn't flinch as the jagged edge of the shattered roof dug into his broad shoulder, drawing a slow, steady line of blood that soaked into his heavy flannel shirt. His entire focus was locked on her. Keep your eyes on me, Chloe, Bear instructed, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the howling wind. Don't look at the dark. Look right here. She blinked through the mixture of blood and rainwater, stinging her eyes. My dad, she whispered, her voice trembling violently. He's at Cedar Sinai. His heart, I was just trying to get to him. And you will, Bear replied without a second of hesitation. You're going to see him, but right now, you need to fight for me. You need to stay awake. Above them on the highway, the rest of the Hells Angels chapter had transformed the chaotic accident scene into a highly organized tactical perimeter. Dozen heavy Harley-Davidsons were lined up along the treacherous curve, their bright LED headlamps cutting through the blinding storm to illuminate the steep ravine and warn any oncoming, speeding semi-trucks of the hazard. Burly men in rain-slicked leather cuts were directing traffic with military precision, completely ignoring the freezing downpour. Down in the mud, a lean, older biker with a long gray braid and a patch that read iron scrambled down the embankment, clutching a massive olive-drab canvas bag. Med Kit Bear, Iron shouted, sliding the last 10 feet on his heavy leather boots. He popped the brass clasps and pulled out a rigid cervical collar, handing it through the window. Tommy got through to dispatch from the call box. Life flight is grounded because of the storm cell, but county fire and heavy rescue are en route. 20 minutes out. 20 minutes is a lifetime down here, Bear muttered grimly. With astonishing dexterity for a man of his size, he expertly slid the rigid plastic collar around Chloe's neck, securing it tightly to immobilize her cervical spine. Only then did he slowly remove his hands, though he stayed pressed against the car to block the wind. Suddenly, a sickening, metallic groan echoed through the ravine. Chloe gasped as the entire car lurched downward. The torrential rain had turned the steep, 70-foot embankment into a treacherous mudslide. The soil beneath the overturned Civic was rapidly washing away, and gravity was beginning to claim the 2-ton wreckage. If the car slid any further down the steep, rocky drop-off into the rushing creek below, the crushed roof would entirely cave in, instantly crushing her. Where losing the embankment, iron roared, scrambling backward as the car shifted another horrifying 2 inches. The suspension squealed under the shifting weight. "Nobody moves from this car," Bear bellowed, his voice echoing like thunder. He threw his entire 300-pound frame against the side of the crumpled vehicle, his heavy boots sinking deep into the mud as he tried to act as a human wedge against the sliding metal. Wyatt, Dutch. At the security chains off the bikes. Now, total chaos erupted, yet it was executed with the fierce, unspoken coordination of a brotherhood accustomed to operating on the absolute edge. 4 massive bikers sprinted up the slippery incline, practically throwing themselves at their motorcycles. They stripped off the heavy, interwoven steel security chains they used to lock their bike's chains thick enough to tow a small boat. They slid back down the mountain, essentially surfing the mud, dragging the heavy steel. "Wrap the rear axle," Bear commanded, his face turning crimson from the sheer exertion of holding the slipping vehicle in place. The muscles in his neck strained against his tattoos. "Tie it off to that old-growth redwood." Wyatt, a heavily scarred biker with a terrifying skull tattooed across his throat, dove into the freezing mud beneath the precarious, teetering back end of the car. He completely ignored the very real danger that the vehicle could snap his spine if it dropped. He looped the thick steel chain through the twisted rear axle, throwing the heavy metal hook to Dutch, who sprinted toward a massive ancient redwood tree 15 feet away. The car groaned again, sliding another agonizing inch. Chloe screamed as the crushed dashboard pressed tighter against her numb legs. "Pull!" Bear roared. 4 members of the Hells Angels grabbed the thick steel chain. With a synchronized, guttural shout, they dug the heels of their heavy engineer boots deep into the muddy hillside and pulled back with every ounce of brute strength they possessed. Beans popped on their forearms. Their leather cuts stretched tight across their shoulders. They weren't just pulling metal. They were anchoring a woman's life to the earth with their bare hands. The chain went entirely taut, vibrating with the immense tension. The car gave one final, terrifying shudder, the rear tires lifting slightly off the mud, before the chains arrested its descent. It was locked in place, suspended between gravity and the sheer willpower of the outlaws. "Hold it!" Bear yelled. "Nobody let go of that line until fire and rescue gets here." For the next 15 agonizing minutes, the men stood in the freezing, torrential downpour, their hands wrapped around raw steel, acting as living anchors. None of them complained. None of them faltered. Bear climbed back into the window frame, his breathing heavy, his hands covered in mud and Chloe's blood. He looked down at her terrified, pale face, offering that same, impossibly gentle smile. "Like I said, sweetheart, the angels are with you. We aren't letting you go." The distant, wailing siren of a fire engine finally pierced the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Red and blue strobe lights began to reflect off the wet canopy of the pine trees, casting eerie, shifting shadows down into the dark ravine. The cavalry had finally arrived. Captain Miller of the county fire department rappelled down the muddy slope, a heavy flashlight in one hand and a medical jump bag strapped to his back. He expected to find a chaotic, hopeless scene. Instead, he found a perfectly stabilized trauma environment, guarded by men most people crossed the street to avoid. He paused, his flashlight sweeping over the 4 giant bikers holding the tension line, their boots buried ankle-deep in the mud, and finally resting on Bear, who was meticulously monitoring Chloe's pulse. "Status?" Captain Miller asked, dropping the authoritative tone he usually reserved for civilian bystanders. He recognized an expert when he saw one. Female, late 20s. Bear reported, barking out the medical handoff with the precision of a seasoned combat medic. "High-speed rollover, severe rear-end impact, resting inverted. Suspected L-spine compression, bilateral lower extremity paralysis. I have applied a rigid C-collar and stabilized the airway. Pulse is thready 110. She's severely hypothermic. We've chained the axle to the tree, but the ground is completely unstable. Captain Miller stared at the massive, bearded outlaw in sheer disbelief for a fraction of a second before nodding sharply. Excellent work. Couldn't have done it better myself. We're bringing down the jaws. Within minutes, the ravine was flooded with heavily geared firefighters. Hydraulic lines were run down the slope, connecting to a massive yellow generator that roared to life. The rescue team brought down the heavy hydraulic cutters, the infamous jaws of life. "Ma'am, we're going to have to cut the B-pillar and peel the roof back to get the dash off your legs," Captain Miller explained, leaning into the window. "It's going to be incredibly loud, and the car is going to shake violently. We need to cover you." Chloe's chest heaved with fresh panic. The thought of the heavy machinery tearing the metal apart inches from her face was paralyzing. She looked frantically for Bear, but the firefighters had pushed him back to make room for their equipment. "Bear," she cried out, her voice cracking. The giant biker immediately shoved his way past a stunned firefighter. He didn't ask for permission. He reached up, unbuttoned his heavy, rain-soaked denim vest, the one adorned with the legendary Hell's Angels death head patch, and pulled it off. Underneath, he wore only a soaked black t-shirt. He crawled back into the jagged opening of the car, completely ignoring the sharp metal tearing at his clothes. "I'm right here," Bear said softly. He draped his heavy, patched vest completely over Chloe's head and upper torso, shielding her face and neck from the impending shower of shattered glass and flying debris. He then wrapped his massive bare arms around her, essentially acting as a human blast shield. "Close your eyes, Chloe. Just listen to the rhythm of my breathing." The deafening, mechanical crunch of the hydraulic cutters engaging metal was terrifying. The car shrieked as the firefighters sheared through the reinforced steel pillars. Sparks cascaded like a deadly fireworks display, bouncing off Bear's broad back and sizzling in the cold rain. He didn't flinch. He held her tight, speaking quietly into her ear over the chaotic noise, recounting mundane stories about his own motorcycle to keep her grounded in reality. With an earth-shattering pop, the heavy machinery forced the crushed dashboard upward. The paralyzing pressure on Chloe's lower half vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, terrifying rush of blood and agonizing nerve pain. "She's clear. Slide the backboard," Miller shouted. Carefully, expertly, they slid Chloe out from the mangled tomb of the Honda Civic. Strapped tightly to the rigid yellow backboard, she was covered in thermal blankets to combat the severe hypothermia. As they hoisted her up the steep, muddy embankment, using a complex rope pulley system, she managed to turn her head slightly against the constraints of the neck brace. Standing in the mud, soaked to the bone, covered in grease and blood, the Hells Angels watched her ascend in absolute silence. Bear stood at the front of the pack, holding his muddy, ruined vest. He raised 2 fingers to his temple in a quiet, respectful salute. Then the darkness of the ravine swallowed them up. 6 grueling, agonizing months later, the afternoon sun beat down on the pristine pavement of the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center parking lot. Chloe sat in a lightweight aluminum wheelchair near the sliding glass entrance doors. Her father, William, looking thin but vibrantly alive, stood behind her, his hands resting gently on the handles of her chair. The paralysis had not been permanent. The crushed dashboard had severely compressed her spinal cord, but because Bear had stabilized her neck and prevented any further twisting, the cord had not been severed. After 2 extensive surgeries and months of agonizing physical therapy that tested every ounce of her spirit, she had regained feeling in her legs. She was still relying on the chair for long distances, but she was walking again. A low, familiar rumble began to vibrate through the concrete. The hospital security guards instinctively tensed as the deafening roar of heavy V-twin engines echoed off the glass facade of the building. A convoy of 12 immaculate custom Harley-Davidsons rolled into the circular driveway, their chrome blinding in the California sun. The riders cut their engines in unison, the sudden silence heavy with anticipation. They dismounted, a formidable wall of black leather, heavy boots, and outlaw patches. Hospital staff froze, watching nervously as the giant men strode toward the entrance. Leading the pack was Bear. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his cut was clean, but he looked just as imposing as the night he pulled her from the abyss. He walked directly up to Chloe, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "Look at you," Bear said, his gravelly voice thick with genuine emotion. "Sitting in the sunshine. Beats the hell out of a ditch on Highway 395, doesn't it?" Tears immediately flooded Chloe's eyes. She didn't say a word. She pushed herself up from the wheelchair, her legs trembling slightly with the effort. Her father reached out to steady her, but she waved him off. Taking 2 slow, agonizingly deliberate steps forward, she threw her arms around the giant biker's neck, burying her face into his heavy leather cut. Bear wrapped his massive arms around her, returning the embrace with a gentleness that still defied all logic. Behind him, Wyatt, Dutch, Iron, and the rest of the crew broke into wide, genuine grins, nodding respectfully to her father. "Thank you," she sobbed into his chest. "You saved my life. You saved my dad's life, too, by letting me get to him." Bear pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, beautifully polished piece of metal attached to a leather cord. It was a custom-machined medallion bearing the insignia of their chapter. "We don't give these out to just anyone, darlin'," Bear said softly, placing the necklace over her head. "But you proved you got more fight in you than half the men I rode with in the valley. You're family now, and family always answers the call." As the bikers gathered around, shaking her father's hand and offering gruff words of encouragement, Chloe looked down at the medallion resting against her chest. She had learned the most profound lesson of her life in the darkest, coldest place on earth. Heroes don't always ride white horses. Sometimes they ride heavy iron, wear the patches of outlaws, and possess hearts brave enough to hold the weight of the world when it all comes crashing down. Did this pulse-pounding story of survival, shattered stereotypes, and unexpected brotherhood leave you speechless? Sometimes most terrifying moments reveal the greatest heroes hiding in plain sight. If Bear's incredible act of compassion moved you, hit that like button. Share this unbelievable true story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life dramas. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments below.